Welcome back, everyone. And you are a very engaged audience. Thank you so much. There's some super questions and points in the chat, and we can pick some of those up at the end of the morning. So it now gives me a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Stan Papoulias, who's going to talk on Not Task and Finish, PPI work in a culture of performance management. And Stan is a research fellow at the Service User Research Enterprise, King's College, London. Having trained and worked in cultural studies, Stan moved to health services research and a user survivor-led perspective in 2012. They're interested in understanding the place of both user/survivor-led methodologies and patient and public involvement within current research environments and systems. They're currently funded by NIHR to explore the work of PPI leads in health research institutions. As someone who lives with long-term mental distress, Stan turned to academic work in order to gain a greater understanding of how what hurts produces the present in which we live. Over to you, Stan.
Thank you very much, Mary. So today I will be talking about a longer piece of work I'm involved in, as Mary mentioned, which is to do with the work that PPI workers, staff, leads do within NIHR, the NIHR family and grant environments. And it's kind of a very partial look at this work, partly because some of the other speakers are touching in different ways on some of the themes that emerged from my kind of interview so far, which are themes around emotional work that will be addressed by Alison, and also invisible work. I will talk a little bit about that, which Lynn gestured at. And also, I think I want to follow up from what Savi was talking about in terms of the less recognized or less valued aspects of work, relational work. And the title comes from a quote of one of my participants who said that, PPI, patient public involvement, isn't task and finish. So it's a kind of work that has a different order to it, a different logic to it, from the dominant kind of logic of how projects work, particularly within the NHS, the NIHR, and so on. And it has a different and longer time and duration. It is just continuous, it is here, there, and everywhere. There's a sense in which you cannot sort of lay hold of it very easily. Now, the questions that I started with this project are looking at the work undertaken by PPI staff, practitioners in research within the NIHR, and also looking at how institutional infrastructures, reporting procedures, and metrification might contribute or constrain this work in its sustainability and impact, and what can be done about it. So I want to talk a little bit now about institutional infrastructures. First, I just want to say very quickly that this is a 3-phase project, which is qualitative, and it's looking at both talking to and gaining the perspectives of PPI leads, but also observing the practice of PPI leads in the various teams and various stakeholders through which they work and networks, and sort of producing guidelines or methodologies for better practice. But right now, I just want to talk about infrastructures and the NIHR in particular. So I have there this idea that the NIHR, the National Institute of Health Research, is a stronghold of new public management models. This is comes from a really interesting paper by Caffrey and colleagues, The Strange Resilience of New Public Management, where they analyze the structure of the NIHR, how it funds research, how it sort of sets up research priorities, and the importance of value for money. So new public management are techniques from the private sector brought to rationalize the public sector, and it is a kind of process that has been working its way through the public sector in the UK since the 1980s and Thatcher, and sort of intensified as well in the 90s through New Labour. And this management technique focuses on efficiency, top-down control, performance monitoring, on value for money, cost cutting, deliverables and output controls. There's a sort of very strong audit culture, transparency and accountability, competition, fields of competition of different agents, open different actors within the public sector, and flexibilization. What that means is that workers within the sector can no longer expect work security or long-term employment, but there is an emphasis on changes in the organization according to its needs, so that it can become lean and mean, and so on, short contracts, and of course innovation. Now, you may be familiar with these characteristics as characteristics of the NHS and to a degree, and the NIHR perhaps. And I just wonder, and the question is, how does PPI as a type of work of doing PPI, bringing in public and service users and patients within research, how does that work within this logic? And the other question is, what kinds of invisible labour might emerge or be disturbed through new public management methods? Now, when I talk about invisible labour, I just want to clarify, I know that people use this term, and you've heard it today, in different ways. It was kind of coined in the 1980s to refer to feminist work in the 1970s about housework, about caring labour, about the domestic chores that women do, which are considered to be labour of love, or not labour at all, but acts of love, and to try and introduce this idea that caring is labour, that domestic work is labour, child rearing is labour, except it is unpaid. And not only is it labour, but it is a kind of labour that sustains and makes possible paid labour. In other words, you know, reproduction of workers produces more workers, and that sort of having workers fed and within a kind of patriarchal society, fed and looked after and so on, is how labour production continues. They're able to work. But then the term invisible labour became kind of expanded to talk about other kinds of underpaid or less seen work that take place in the workplace as well. So relational work, network building, and so on. Behind the scenes work, how we learn to do something, skill, tacit knowledge, the kinds of knowledges we have when we are in a profession for a long time. Now, you can imagine that with new public management techniques, when we have short contracts where organizations innovate, change, restructure, that kind of tacit labor, the skill that is acquired over time, is more likely to be disrupted, to disappear. So you cut up people's job descriptions into tasks that can be performed by different people that may not require that skill and know-how, because they are temporary. So if we look at the distribution of labour within PPI worker roles, my title was PPI leads, and people said to me, well, you know, are you only going to be looking at leads? What about the care coordinators? So, the coordinators, not the care coordinators. So there is a distinction here between a lead who is a strategic figure, who looks at strategy, who looks at outputs, and the coordinator or officer, typically who does work on the ground, does the relationship building. So a kind of visible performance geared figure, the lead, versus the kind of invisible relationally geared figure, the coordinator or officer, and then we have the administrator as well. But in reality, that's not how it works for the most part. These roles can kind of shift and change, and those responsibilities. Sometimes we have one person doing everything. Sometimes we have people changing from one role to the other. And sometimes we have, quite frequently, workers hired in more junior roles, so band 5 for the NHS, with high role responsibilities, which are more management geared, band 7. What I'm interested in is how elements of the work that PPI leads stroke coordinators do diverges from organizational understandings of what working time is. In other words, that work may not be readily measurable and converted to deliverables and outputs. There are aspects of the work that are more readily, but then aspects of the work that are not, and there is a complexity there. Secondly, a lot of that work does not fit within task-based logic. So the idea that there is a method to working and talking to people is kind of resisted on some level. One of the participants talks about it being a feeling, you can't write it down. I just talk. Interestingly, that talk then needs to be converted to something else, to a method, and standardized in order to fit in a report or to be scaled up. But what happens when that standardization takes place? What happens to the talk? Another participant talks about it's very difficult to control a conversation when you are in a meeting with a bunch of professionals. You have an agenda and items, but when you are in a different kind of relationship, that agenda and those items go out of the window. Although, of course, we know that they don't always go out of the window. So there is the task-based logic, not adhering to the timing and placing of work. So the timing of work, people talked about the time it takes to develop relationships, to develop a closeness with people over time, to talk about their children, their cats, and to have that kind of intimacy, rather than, for example, sending an email and be done with it. The email is going to bounce back unless the relational work has already taken place. In terms of not being work in place, but somewhere else, a lot of people talk about community outreach not being in the office, or of course here in COVID times, we're talking about different senses of place. But so not being bound by what an office kind of space is, and therefore not being recognized by their colleagues, perhaps, for example, nurses or people who are frontline workers in the NHS, not being recognized as doing work at all, but as kind of, as someone said, doing Netflix and chill. So there is a sense that colleagues feel perhaps resentment or discomfort with that kind of different kind of flexibility. And finally, PPI as something that cannot, elements of which cannot be picked up by the reporting system. I know Lynn talked about wasted labor. You put all this work into setting up a project, you don't get the funding, that's the end of that for the most part. And another participant talks about relationships cannot be recorded, but if they're not recorded, of course, within the sort of management procedures we have, they did not happen. So it's this kind of work which is not quite there, not quite registering as having happened. And to conclude, I just wanted to sort of reiterate that there is something about elements of PPI work that is at odds with the institutional norms and the performance criteria about what constitutes working time. Something that is caught and cannot be reduced to the logic of outputs, the logic of deliverables, or to the efficiency time, to the sort of lean and mean of new management systems. They take time. They need continuity. They need the same people to be there for a long time. A lot of my participants talked about, you know, having to move in, and the old guard moved out with a new grant because a new director wanted to sort of reshape things from the beginning. So all the acquired knowledge is gone. Again, all that invisible tacit know-how is gone, out with the old, in with the new. So logic of outputs, performance management, deliverables. There is a kind of ill fit between those principles and how the work of public involvement happens. And the question is here, what are the consequences of raising this work to visibility through reports, through metrics and so on, without challenging the systems of performance management which define visibility? And I want to sort of end with this. People talk about the need for culture change, right? Organizational change. But what would it take to rethink the principles upon which the new public management works? To rethink the foundation of metricization, of value, and of marketization within public sector systems today. Thank you.
Thank you, Stan. We have time for a couple of comments. You raised a number of issues and tensions, Stan. Sometimes tensions can be creative. How do you see the creativity playing out in PPI world? Okay, so there's a lot of interesting creative work being done.
and also that's what interests me. But one of the issues with, let's say, metricization and the kind of the way in which research, for example, is regulated, is that a certain kind of creativity cannot quite work in research. Why? Because you have to set everything up in advance. You have to say exactly how you're going to do something, what you're going to do, what are the outputs, what are your timelines, and so on. And when it comes to certain kinds of research, like qualitative research or ethnography, where you have to observe, it's very, very difficult to do this within those kinds of parameters, so you adapt. And I'd say the same applies for patient public involvement, service user involvement, where a lot of creative ways of being with people are kind of short-circuited because of the kind of reporting system into which they fit. Not all, and that is the question, what are the leeways within that? I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's great that you're doing the projects, and I look forward to seeing the results. But I think someone raised the question in relation to payment, about the fear of stipulating a policy, a payment policy, for fear of getting it wrong. And someone else raised the point about 0 hours contracts, and that is really a form of abuse, should we say? People have got 0 hours contracts. So there's a number of comments here.
I think maybe the 0 hour contract, I think I saw that before the break from Irene. PPI can mean quite a commitment, invisible time when research team and involvement are applying for funds, perhaps a year or two of this, yes. Sometimes ending in no funding, exactly. And then however long the project runs, plus the effect of COVID, which has meant a lot of rethinking. Yeah, I mean, my worry is whether at the moment we say, as people have said, you know, there's an opening for more relationships, co-production or faux production. My worry is that the likelihood of proliferating unpaid labour increases, both for people who are actually working in PPI, but also certainly service users and carers and patients. And I take the point that Lynn was making, that payment isn't always a solution, but I'm just also wondering about the levels of unpayment that are going on, as you, Lynn, said as well.
Well, Zoe made a comment that NIHR are trying to increase payment for PPI. And if I can just say, Zoe also raised the point that there's going to be a potential call coming out for a development grant, and that'll be published soon. So thank you, Zoe, for the heads up on that. I think we are now just on target for our next speaker. Well, Tamara is a lived experienced consultant and activist, and she's going to speak with us on call to action, equal employment of staff in the lived experience professions. And Tamara White-Jeans is, she uses social media to bring awareness to the inequalities and discrimination faced by people working with lived experience professions. She founded MAD Studies Birmingham Group, which convenes monthly via Zoom to bring together people who write MAD literature knowledge with an audience that interests a range of demographics, disciplines and interests. She is an executive board member of the British and Irish Group for the Study of Personality Disorder, works within the NIHR, and her MSc was looking at working effectively with personality disorder and was undertaken from the lens of a lived experience professional. So over to you, Tamara.
Thank you. That's great. So yeah, thanks for the introduction, Mary, and I'll just say that this talk has come very much from a mental health background, because I do understand that the audience is coming from a sort of a range of backgrounds, so just sort of bear that in mind. I know that the lived experience professions is very developed within mental health compared to some other areas. Okay, so this talk is actually a call to action, and I'm asking everybody in attendance to commit to supporting the equal employment of staff working in the lived experience professions. And first of all, you might be wondering, what are the lived experience professions? And I'm going to say there's a bit of a disclaimer here in that there's no real official terminology when it comes to people who work within lived experience type roles. What I'm doing really is using lived experience professions as an umbrella term, really to refer to disciplines where a lived experience of a disability or mental health condition is a what they would call a genuine occupational requirement of the post. So this is a term that's used in employment legislation to refer to posts where a protected characteristic is central to the work being undertaken in that role. You can tell I've been down the ACAS website and spoken to a equality and diversity consultant. So basically these types of roles cut across a range of disciplines, and examples of these roles include things like peer support workers, lived experience researchers, lived experience consultants, lived experience trainers, group facilitators, etc., etc. You've probably heard of us in lots of different ways. So what we all hold in common is that those of us who work in these posts use an experiential lens through which to approach our work. So the insight from lived experience is used in combination with that wider lived experience knowledge of the field. That wider lived experience professions knowledge that's within the field. So what I would say is that you can have personal lived experience, but there also is a wider sort of knowledge that has developed as our discipline has developed, that can be tapped into by people within the lived experience professions. I'll come on to that. So basically we use that in a combination of lived experience, personal lived experience knowledge, wider lived experience knowledge, but also it can be used with it's often used with knowledge of other disciplines. So for instance, if we're working within research, a lot of us are trained researchers as well. So what you will find is that we're dual disciplined. We're not actually, it's not actually less than, it's actually and as well. So you kind of end up being dual disciplined. Often people will come from a position of either having lived experience and then having to then go on to, I'll give you an example. I was trained as a researcher and I worked in research, commercial and third sector before I was a lived experience consultant, and I worked from a completely different lens to the one that I work from as a lived experience researcher, and I've had to almost retrain to do that. So it's like another discipline. So it's something to remember that when you're working with people who work in these lived experience disciplines, it's a specialism, and it's something that really needs to be respected. And there's a reason why it needs to be, people need to have had that training, and it needs to have been given by people who've worked within that field, as opposed to let's say organisations that are having a go, because often they don't know. So yeah, basically what you're probably wondering as well is what the difference is between the majority of people that are working within public and patient involvement. So thinking about all of you that are watching at the moment, lived experience practitioners, and partly that will be because most of you that are drawn into working in this area of work will have lived experience of some form. A lot of people will have either personal lived experience or lived experience of, you know, having friends or family that have got mental health condition, and you'll be thinking, actually I use this within my work, so why do we have to employ lived experience practitioners to do this? So one thing I would say is that with generic public patient involvement posts, working from that lens would be a choice, and not everyone chooses to work that way. Working, it's very different, as I've explained before. It's a specific skill. The other thing is that part of the role is actually being visible, because when you work in other roles, this is something where it is not visible, and part of these roles are doing them as people with mental health conditions. The reason why that's important is because the stigma at the moment is so great, and I think a lot of you who live with mental health conditions will know this. You know that you know, if you're not feeling too good, or you know, if you're having if you have bipolar, or if you have schizophrenia, psychosis, it's very difficult to be honest about that within a team, or to be open about that when it comes to periods of being unwell. So there's something about people who are able to actually say, actually, this is me. I live with this condition. It's okay. In fact, I'm able to use this within the role that I do. It's something that is it can be a benefit, and it's something that can be used to connect in the work that we do. It's a valuable thing, and there's something about that then helps to change the culture and the way that people think about lived experience, the way that they think about that within the teams and the organisation that they're working in. And only then, once that happens, can we really work and engage. I'm laughing at that because I think something that Falaki said earlier, you know, hard to engage with. It ain't that people are hard to engage with, it's that you know, people aren't being listened to. So it's not about being hard to engage with, it's about, you know, ensuring that actually you know, we are all here and it's okay to be as we are within the organisations that we're in, and then we will be able to speak to people on our level. It will be a, you know, a peer-to-peer thing. It's not going to be a on the wonk kind of thing. So this is why it's important. The other thing as well is that we need to think about, where did PPI come from? You know, what are its roots? And, you know, who campaigned for this in the first place? Because it wasn't the NIHR, it wasn't organisations. This was campaigned for by activists, particularly back in the 80s, but, you know, people doing it from 60s, 70s. Actually, people doing it as long as we've been mad. So, you know, but particularly from the 80s, think about those, you know, those bed push protests. This is where this all came from. So these jobs and project funding, they exist because of activists, but service user led organisations and collaboratives are gradually disappearing. And one thing that we know is that over 220 NSOM members have been lost in the last 2 years, and that's due to a loss of funding. And where is that funding going? It's going to large PPI projects and non-lived experience-led charities. They're getting the bulk of this, not employing us, not partnering with us, you know. So what happens to the actual lived experience knowledge? It gets lost, and yet that's where it came from. That's where the history came from. So this is why it's so important to ensure that if this is going to happen, actually this knowledge starts to be assimilated back into organisations. And we're not talking about organisations' version of what a peer support worker is. You know, we'll train up a few peer support workers. There'll be a band too. We'll pay them like rubbish. We'll basically get them to be support workers and slap a peer on the beginning of it. No. You want posts where there's job descriptions that ensure that these roles include a responsibility to link back to movements within the MAD community, to activism, issues that service users are raising, to champion lived experience work and research in the area. That's really essential to ensure that that comes back into the organisation, and to ensure that these openly MAD employees are actually within decision-making rooms where those and these posts are actually being employed on an equal level. You know, if you've got a boardroom of directors and they're being paid, grief knows what, then we make sure that the patient director is also being paid grief knows what. If they all get their £1 million houses to retire on, so does the patient director. So, and the same with the decision-making power, that it has to be equal all the way down. Again, then you've got the issues of hierarchy, and that it's a terrible way of doing things and it should be cooperative, but that's another complete different conversation. But really, co-production is 50-50. It's about partnership working, and to do this we have to start at home. It's in the workplace, and essentially we've got to get our house in order before we invite people to dinner. It's impossible to co-produce with service users if we can't co-produce in the workplace. Lots of people take this as a threat. Like I said, I bear the scars of this. I'm laughing. It ain't funny. To give power is also to give up power, and that really scares people. So the level of discrimination that people face is absolutely horrific. It's a bit raw, to be honest, but I will say that locally we had 40 peers employed. I think we've got about 3 or 4 left. Some ended up from the experience in hospital, so not great. Also did some research where got stats, had not been able to write it up because it's raw. So what can we do? Anyway, there's lots of sad stuff. What can we do? So people here, if you've got recruiting power, recruit us. If you're going to do that, partner with us to do it. Make sure you hire LXP consultants to guide you through that process. If you're a manager, ask why your job isn't co-produced, because you're working within PPI, and it should be. If you're a lead on a research project, basically those lead roles should be co-produced. There should always be two people on those. If you're a team member, ask where your LXP colleagues are, and when you do see them, make sure that you welcome them, because support is about listening to them and listen to them about how they do their role, and back them up with that, because being there, they're going to face discrimination. When they tell you about that, believe them. If they need a shoulder to cry on, don't think they're weak, because you got to know that they're strong, and they're responding in a normal way to extreme systemic discrimination, and they're actually being very brave, systemic pioneers for change. So to sum up, this talk is a call to action. I'm asking everybody in attendance to use whatever power you have, whether it's recruitment, whether it's just being able to be welcoming, that's a big thing, to support the equal 50-50 employment of staff in the lived experience professions. Boom, I'm done.
Thank you, Tamara. If you don't mind, we will move straight on to Alison Faulkner. And Alison is going to be talking about Love's Labour's Lost, uncovering the emotional labour of involvement and co-production in the mental health research. And Alison is a survivor researcher with around 30 years experience of working in mental health services, training and consultancy. He has a PhD from City University of London on the role and value of experiential knowledge in mental health research. She has been self-employed since 2002 and has worked for most of the major UK mental health charities, including the National Survivor User Network, Mind, and Together with Mental Wellbeing, as well as for a few UK universities. She has, for the most part, remained on the margins of academia. Alison has personal experience of mental distress and of using mental health services, including inpatient care, medication, psychotherapy, A&E, and crisis services. So, Alison, over to you.
Yes, so I'm basically going to talk about a piece of work that I carried out. It was funded by the McPin Foundation. Some of you will have heard of the McPin Foundation. And it was prompted basically by an interest in some of the challenges that face people in employing, I mean, you know, in many ways, threads that have already been shared throughout this morning, particularly what Tamar was just saying, about the emotional element of the work that we bring in when we work with our own lived experience. And I think that affects us in many different ways. It's something I've thought about a lot over the years, but also it was something that was raised in a different context by people working at the McPin Foundation. So what I'm basically going to do is just talk a bit about that piece of research and the findings and some of my own reflections on that. But I think it's great to bring together some of the threads, and I hope we'll have the chance to do that after when I finished, bring together some of the threads from previous talks. So for example, Savvy talking about the broader context of what is valued in society, and also Stan talking about some of those really sort of the structural sort of challenges of the working environment. But so I'll talk a bit about that as well. I mean, this definitely some of the findings touch on those elements. So there is a paper, anyone who's interested can follow that one up. We had a paper published in Disability and Society. The original plan was to use this as preparation for a larger project to apply for funding, but COVID intervened at that point, so it never got off the ground. I imagine there must be many other projects like that, so it was just funded as a small piece of work by McPin's internal resources. We started our research talking to each other, myself and Rose Thompson from McPin Foundation, talking to each other, interviewing each other about this whole sort of field of emotional, what does it mean to bring our lived experience into, not just into the research and the content of the research, but also the actual workplace. So we interviewed a purposive sample of 10 people who identified in many different ways. Some would say that they were survivor or peer researchers, some were employed, some self-employed, and some were involved in the PPI sort of terminology. There were a couple of PPI leads and a couple of people who are managers or supporters of people who are involved in research. So wanting to bring people with lived experience into their research in the university, and some of the challenges that involved. And some of the ethical issues that we were aware of right from the very beginning. A couple of people turned down invitation to be interviewed because we knew them, other people would know them. Interviewing just 10 people might render them visible when they wish to remain anonymous, and invisible in the sense of what they wanted to actually talk about. And so we know that there's a hidden conversation out there that we couldn't have. Also, the ethics of problematizing something that you actually want to happen, that you're in another space, you're advocating for more service user involvement in research, but in this space you're problematizing it. Will you give people in power, positions of power, will you give them an excuse not to then do it more, because they look at this and they'll say, well, see all the problems, and it hurts people, it harms people, so maybe we shouldn't do it. So that's a kind of an anxiety. Anyway, I will go on to some of the themes. And one of the biggest themes was about negotiating identity. I very much in this presentation focusing on what people actually said rather than on my interpretation, although clearly it's my interpretation as well, or our interpretation, I should say. So negotiating identity. So for some people, it was finding something that fits. This sense of finding something that actually would enable them to bring together their lived experience with research skills. That would be great. This is my way into something that I feel I'm really passionate about. And it's not, that wasn't necessarily my background originally, but I feel like I could give a lot to it. Then, on the other hand, an ambivalence, the potential for a fixed identity. So somebody's saying it's a double-edged sword. Maybe now this is my only identity. Is that all people see you as? And the fact that you do a lot of things that don't require lived experience on a day-to-day basis. And then we spoke to a couple of people as well who talked about the complexities of intersectional identities. It feels like in this role, race and lived experience are both visible, whereas in life, race is always visible to me, but lived experience isn't necessarily, because I don't have to talk about lived experience in everything that I do, whereas in work, it's something that's there all the time. So there's a sort of an issue there about what's visible and what's not visible, and in what context it's visible and not visible. And we'll say a bit more about that in a moment. Another theme was about using the actual lived experience in the research. So somebody's talking about the distress, but also the passion. How can I use that knowledge in a way that's constructive? I want to, because people were talking about really wanting to represent the voices of the people who weren't coming to platforms such as this to talk, people in the wards that I was observing. So and balancing distress and purpose. It's part. So this quotation, the second quotation on this page, is from somebody who was managing research projects that involved people with lived experience, also employed people, employed and involved. It's part of the rationale for doing the work is that people will have a personal connection with the thing that we're doing research about, the questions we're asking, or the people we're talking to. So it's a kind of an asset, but the value of that is also challenging. And then there's somebody there also at the end of that slide who's saying you're trying to use your knowledge and managing your emotions so you can stay afloat. So this kind of sense in which if you are actually doing research on something that is directly speaking to your own lived experience, interviewing people on inpatient wards, interviewing people in crisis or who have self-harm, self-injured, and you have done this too, then that kind of challenge was very much at the forefront of what some people were talking about. This third theme very much touches on the identity theme, as well as something a little bit slightly different. But in this one, what we found was people talking about embodiment, the sense in which you as an individual, you're embodying mental distress in that alienating workplace, the workplace that is perhaps doing research. I mean, I'm speaking from a mental health perspective here, and I appreciate that this will not apply necessarily across all health and social care experiences, but there was something about embodying mental distress, which is a fundamentally discriminated against sort of identity. It's an invalidated identity in many ways. But then you are expected, you are embodying the distress of all the people that you potentially or others are doing research on. It's a pathologizing sort of potential role. Fitting in and not presenting a challenge was what people felt they needed to do, because you're already challenging people's notion of the researcher and the workplace. And so you're working hard not to present too much of a challenge quite often, which is a real dilemma for some people. Interesting, two people that we interviewed used the phrase performing monkey, quite, obviously independently. So when it suited, I was a traditional researcher that should do it all. I mean, you can't have it both ways, is what that person said. And really what they were saying was, on another day, they were expected to produce in the environment that Stan was very articulately describing, in that sort of performance-oriented environment. And then another day, you're the sort of the service user, the person who has the lived experience to bring to the table. And then also a couple of people that we talked to just talked about the difficulty of being a person of colour, a black researcher, black person with lived experience, and embodying the other in really very predominantly white organisation. So yes, so this person was saying that they had to console and support a white person through their struggles of dealing with their whiteness. And if I had to just pick one most difficult experience, they said, that was it. And then another one who said, don't let anyone else convince you that something that they've never ever experienced is not happening. And that was in the context of microaggressions, racist microaggressions in the workplace. So working environment, I won't go into this too much because Stan very much described very much what we're talking about in this sense, but just to say that, again, this is the dilemma of the imperative towards productivity and the perverse academic incentives. On the one hand, there is a requirement from funders to involve, to have the lived experience voice in the research process. But on the other hand, there are not the incentives within the academic sort of measurement of academic success of an organisation. There are not the incentives there to count and to account for that work. So again, the invisibility. I'm going to speed up slightly. These are some of the strategies for managing, and people talked about personal strategies such as accessing individual therapy. People talked about the importance of collective strategies. So how can we come together and support each other? So they've let the mad people into the academia, but it's kind of like how the mad people start leading projects. So we need that critical mass to support each other in this environment. People talked about workplace strategies, about involving the union was another strategy that people talked about. It's having time to talk about what's going on in these projects, and this dichotomy, this dilemma really of the imperative to achieve, to complete projects, to move on to the next project, to get funding from the next project, doesn't give people the time to reflect on some of these really important issues that make bringing lived experience into the research something that could be meaningful. And then finally, there's systemic strategies. And the systems to respond to those bigger. So I'll just go on to reflections in order to to finish. So these are just a few of my reflections. There are many more, and you know, anyone who's interested, I recommend reading the paper, of course, I'm bound to say that. But intersectional identities and their location within systems of whiteness and power need to be acknowledged. And I haven't talked a great deal about power, but power clearly is one of the sort of threads that runs through a great deal of what we're talking about this morning, really. From a practical point of view, I believe that the starting point should be that everybody needs support, whatever that means to each individual. Now, of course, I'm talking about that now in relation to people with lived experience, to service users, survivor researchers. But I mean, actually, that really does relate to everybody. But I think we shouldn't assume that because somebody won't voice the need for support, that they don't need it, and it should be asked. You know, what support do you need? It should be assumed that it should be, particularly if you're bringing that emotional element of lived experience into the workplace, that should be on the table, that should be there. Negotiating identity is very often an ongoing process. It's not a one-off, let's have a conversation about this at the beginning of a project. It's something that we tend to do all of the time. Particularly in a sort of a culture that is rational, is a culture that is about the rationale of, you know, managing and doing research. So there's that sort of concept of fitting in because you think this is a great opportunity, bringing my lived experience into the work, versus being fixed in that identity. Always, I think that's an ongoing negotiation for people. And again, that relates to the impossibility of emotion. Some other people have written some great articles. Sarah Carr is somebody who I would recommend you looking up about this, embodying distress in what's an effectively a rational and neoliberal culture. And then finally, just the message about emotional labour needs to reach. I mean, this is a big overarching sort of conclusion in many ways. Needs to reach not just the university hierarchy, but the research funders whose demands are often used by academics to excuse poor support or process. And I just want to relate that back to what Savi was saying about the sort of context that we're working within, which is what is valued by society. If research was valued, if involvement, if the lived experience voice was valued, but also that we weren't solely driven by the measurements that Stan was describing, there would be the space for this kind of reflection, this kind of negotiation to thrive. So thank you, I finish.
Thank you very much, Alison. We can now move to questions in general. Thank you all presenters, for you were really good at keeping to time, so thank you very much. That's made my job very easy, so thank you. There are some issues that have arisen from my scanning of the chat, and there seems to be issues around recruiting people and job descriptions and interviews, and I wonder if that is about the professionalization of PPI, because one person said that they were put off applying for a position because they had to have an interview. So if it was more a conversation, then they would be more likely to apply for it. So I think that's something that we really need to think about. Also about the use of language. And I think that's also important. Lynn, you have your hand up.
Yeah, it was just on the professionalisation or not. So I will say that public contributors are like Goldilocks porridge. We have to be just right, but we don't have power over what just right looks like. So sometimes it's like, you know, I'm only allowed to be my lived experience. I'm not allowed to be any more than that. Other opportunities, it's like, I never had a CV until I started doing PPI. You know, submit a CV, you know, write all this stuff, come and be grilled for an hour and a half by 3 people. And, you know, we have no power or control. And I think that there is a space for everyone and all levels of experiences. But it's others have control over us, and it's others saying what our value is. And just, a lot of it has become very, very transactional. I feel, yeah.
Alison?
Oh yes, I just wanted to agree with what Lynn said, and also something that came up from our research. Very strongly, yes, there was this sense that somebody who was managing a group of lived experience advisory panel, which so often we come to call LEAP, was saying, well, I have to provide these perfect lived experience members to go into a research project. They have to be this kind of perfect and not too challenging as well person with the right experience. Yeah, I can see Lynn nodding. I mean, that was definitely something that, you know, came out of our research as well.
Stan raised some interesting points about the metrics and about how universities are judged, and about how experience is valued. And someone else made a comment that we can't forget that many people with lived experience are also trained. They're professional people in their own right, and it's not just about, you know, your lived experience being there. And so Rosie made a comment about the metrics, and is there an opportunity to challenge that? Stan, what do you think about that?
One kind of challenge that has been, I've seen for a while, is people talking about needing, you know, qualitative data as well as metrics to discuss, to evaluate PPI. That's why I was laughing, because we had a conversation about evaluation in the ARC South London very recently. But I think that the problem here is that usually the response to that is that the two work together really well, and let's have a bit of one and a bit of the other. But I think the issue for me is that the whole system of metrics cuts up workplaces and job titles and job responsibilities in a particular way. And so you may have qualitative stuff, but you still are within a particular system which values a certain way of looking at and constructing data out of people's work. So, you know, so that the difference you can make within that, in my view, I could be wrong, is not that great, because you're still the underlying framework is one of performance management. It's just that you now use qualitative data as well. So I am very aware, of course, that, you know, I mean, I know that Tamar's talk was a call for revolution, and, you know, I tend to go all out as well. But I think it would be really interesting to start thinking about how those metrics set up a certain way of looking at what accountability is, what value is, what transparency is, what, of course, efficiency is, and how the justification of efficiency and cost cutting and so on can be used to make very rational judgments and inevitable judgments about who gets left out in the cold, something that COVID has shown us in stark colours.
Moira asked a question about patient directors. So are they likely to become too house trained by host organisations? And should the position be time limited?
I certainly hope not. I think that's why I was saying that that patient directors the roles have to be underpinned by a whole cohort of other patients involved in the system, involved in the organizations, carers and patient, other, for example, Tamar's role, there has to be a whole range of people that actually give that grounding and an accountability as well. I hope that patient directors are there more to shake it up rather than to become house trained. I think in terms of the time limited, there has to be a balance. You have to give people time to actually deliver and influence the system. But yes, that has to be balanced against refreshing a system. So that one, I sit on the fence there, really. I think it really will depend on the circumstances and the individuals. I think Tamar has her hand up as well, so I'll yield to her.
There is definitely a problem with people getting too, as you say, house trained, but there are ways around that. And part of the reason why people become institutionalized is because of the way that the are and the way that things are designed in the beginning. So to move around those structures, you actually need to design them in a way where that won't happen. And the problem is that at the moment we're just getting the NHS and organisations employing people in roles and just basically doing what they've always done. So essentially they will get what they've always got. Whereas this is why what we're trying to do, myself and other activists who well, not just other activists, the whole movement really is just trying to say, well, actually, you need to partner with us, you need to partner with organisations that are lived experience led, or if you're going to develop these roles within organisations, you need to partner with either lived experience led organisations, or in particular lived experience consultants who understands this type of working, who can work with your organisation to ensure that the necessary supports and external supervision is there, and the training is there, and because you need to have the connection back into the movement to understand kind of what's going on. You need to kind of connect back into that knowledge. What happens is the people get to institutionalize because they go into a closed system and they're not kind of reaching out, and but they're supposed to be bridging, and if they're not bridging, and if that's not within their post job description, then it won't be done. And the same really with NHS kind of patient directors. And I'd agree, I've definitely seen it where we've got institutionalized, and it does so much harm to the work that we do. I feel so much about it because I've been harmed when that has happened, and I've seen other people be very harmed. So I'm very passionate about this being done effectively, and also people who are lived experience people within these lived experience senior posts actually being accountable and responsible to the communities that they are working with and representing, to ensure that they should be able to demonstrate that they're kind of linking back, and they need to really kind of own those posts and show that they are what they need to earn that money, that if they're going to be retiring in their £1 million house, like, we don't mind as long as they're going to earn that. So I'll shut up now, but I really strongly feel about this.
As an involvement coordinator who is definitely not going to be retiring into a £1 million house, I'd say that for those of us who are working in involvement, and particularly who I'm employed in it, there is possibly always going to be a tension between the kinds of expectations that not only that institutions may have of us, but that those who fund our institutions or regulate them might have of the institutions. So there are certain things that the National Institute for Health Research would expect of the research collaboration I work for, and it may be important for me to do, and it's important for me to bear those things in mind, as well as the needs and expectations of existing patient service user, carer and public contributors, and of the various community organisations who might have a stake in the kind of research that the research collaboration does. So it's sort of maybe balancing those, seeing whether maybe some of the pressure from outside can be used as an opening for strengthening involvement, and at the same time recognising that certain ways of working and maybe an emphasis on facts and figures can sometimes pull us away from the things that might seem most important. So maybe there's always going to be that level of tension, and perhaps having supportive networks locally and with others who are doing similar kinds of work, or broader involvement community, including contributors, can help us at least to keep thinking about those issues and the importance primarily of making involvement real.
Okay, thanks, Savi. A couple of points. Roy asked, do you think that mental health organisations should be user-led? Is that up your street, Tamar?
Oh yeah, definitely. Either user-led or it's all mental health organisations should be co-produced at the very least, all of them. That means they should be co-produced right from the top all the way down, because essentially, you know, they're taking money to work with us, so work with us right from the top. Nothing about us without us. So don't do to us, because that's what you're doing. If you're not employing us, you're not working with us. So yeah, partner with us.
A question for you, Stan. Can you please clarify what you mean by metrics?
I guess it's kind of turning into numbers or turning into number-like data, different kinds of performance so that you can compare them. So for example, and there are two things arising here. And for example, in ARC, South London, a number of the ARCs, one of the kind of metrics is number of publications and journals, types of journals in terms of the impact, how highly they're thought of as journals within the discipline. Now, the two things that arise, one, which kind of metrics, once you decide that impact is how many journals you have published, then, and that your priorities go that direction, then it's very hard to also include or prioritize, for example, service user needs and service user and community impact in the same way. And the second issue is, so which numbers? And but the second issue for me is broader, which is that once you turn different parts of people's jobs into performance, then those kinds of jobs can be gamed. So people can sort of play with numbers to show that they, or organizations to show that they are in a better place, in a better terms of, in terms of patient safety, quality and so on than others. And so we have kind of the paradox of a trust that can be quite kind of high in terms of quality metrics, but at the same time be revealed to offer terrible service, or there are issues with. So it's how you measure, it's the whole concept of measuring as well. I don't know if others have to.
Lynn?
Yeah, I think it was just on that, you know, I'm like co-producing this piece of research, and I'm not a researcher, you know, and I feel very fortunate to have like been on a journey to feel in a position to be able to do that. And part is, as much as like the qualitative research that we're doing, the results of that will be interesting. I think just as much of that is we're going to really try and, you know, talk about the process of doing that, the emotions, what it meant to us, you know, some of the burdens that are put on people that are supporting us, and just putting that front and centre as much as what our outputs were, because that matters just as much, because if we don't understand these things and we're not honest about the processes, then how are we going to change things? And I think some of this is about being open and honest about the emotions, about the hard things as well, and putting that out there.
Stan?
Just very quickly want to clarify, and thank you, Lynn, because what I said could be seen to mean we really don't need numbers for anything, but numbers are bad. That's not what I meant at all. For example, you really need to be looking at stats to understand the relationship between social deprivation, inequalities, and mental ill health, for example, or bad housing. You know, there are issues of epidemiology, how particular conditions or forms of distress spread and pattern the population, which is very important things to know. But there is a difference between those kinds of metrics and performance-related metrics and performance management. That's the difference for me.
There's one final question from Stella O'Brien. How can we get over the issue of invisible resources? So that might sum up our conversations this morning.
Start things off. Maybe part of it is trying to create more spaces where we talk about some of what is usually invisible, including the resources that are needed or used but don't always get noticed, and also some of the work that goes on and the implications of that work for the people who do it, whether they're people who are employed to do involvement, or people who are being involved, or people for whom their work is a combination of those things. So, for instance, in my ARC, we are trying, I think, to have more discussion about involvement and what it means, not only what needs to happen, but maybe some of the practicalities and the experience of it. And I think, you know, if there are spaces on websites, in newsletters, in discussions, trying to set aside time at team meetings to step aside from the immediate practicalities of how many people need to be written to when, then maybe it's trying to use some of those spaces to open up some of those questions, and also trying to create more supportive spaces, maybe nooks and crannies in institutions and networks where some of those conversations can go on. And thank you very much to those who have taken part in this today in terms of maybe grappling with some tricky issues which don't have easy solutions.
If there's no other comments, I would just like to thank everybody for their contribution, all our presenters and our audience who have been very engaged. So thank you all very much indeed. And I think this is the end of our session. So thank you.